In this section, you will learn about HIPAA privacy requirements. The privacy officer has the responsibility to develop and implement the policies and procedures of the department. The privacy officer is designated to receive and address complaints regarding privacy and must provide additional information as requested about matters covered by the Notice of Privacy Practices. The privacy officer sits in the office of the Director for the Department of Health and Human Services and reports incidents to our privacy official. If electronic client information is involved, immediately call the help desk at extension 72828 to report a potential security incident. As a healthcare provider, the Department of Health and Human Services must comply with HIPAA requirements and train all of its workforce. All Department of Health and Human Services employees, on-site contractors, interns, and volunteers must also comply with HIPAA and take reasonable precautions to ensure that client information is protected. All workforce members, whether they work directly with the clients or not, must complete training on the privacy rule. Training is required upon hire and must be repeated every 3 years. As material changes are implemented, there will be training to appropriate workforce members affected by that change. Documentation of the training should include who attended, the topic covered, and the date the training was held. HIPAA training is mandatory for the Department of Health and Human Services employees and must be passed with a demonstration of competency. Implementation of administrative, physical, and technical safeguards work in tandem with the security rule. Be mindful to safeguard PHI from any intentional or unintentional use or disclosure. Limit incidental uses and disclosures that occur as a result of the otherwise permitted or required uses and disclosures. For example, create safeguards to prevent others from overhearing PHI. The client has a right to file a complaint regarding how we've used or disclosed their information or regarding other related rights. Individuals may file complaints with the Department of Health and Human Services Privacy Officer regarding health information privacy violations or the Department of Health and Human Services Privacy Compliance Program. The form for clients to submit a complaint is located on the Department of Health and Human Services intranet site. Staff may also make a complaint using the Montgomery County Privacy Incident Reporting Form. The Privacy Incident Reporting Form is also found on the intranet. It is against the law to retaliate against a client for exercising the right to file a complaint. This training provides only an overview of client rights. Staff who provide direct client services or supervise such staff complete more in-depth training on these rights, including procedures for responding to client requests. Other confidentiality laws and regulations include the following: the Maryland Confidentiality of Medical Records Act, which protects health and mental health records. The Maryland Human Service Article 1-201, which protects social service and income support information. Federal regulations at 42 CFR Part 2, which protects alcohol and substance abuse program information. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which protects student education records. The Violence Against Women Act, which protects domestic violence and sexual assault victims program information, and federal and state child and adult protection services. Develop and apply appropriate sanctions for the non-compliance with the Department of Health and Human Services policies and procedures. Be sure to document sanctions that are applied. Note, sanctions can be referred to as discipline or corrective action. Violations of the Department of Health and Human Services privacy policies and procedures will subject staff to all of Montgomery County progressive discipline up to and including termination. The Department of Health and Human Services must mitigate to the extent practicable any harmful effects known to the Department of Health and Human Services of a use or disclosure of PHI in violation of the Department of Health and Human Services policies and procedures or the requirements of the privacy rule. If a privacy incident occurs, the department must take any and all reasonable steps to lessen any effects of the incident. The Department of Health and Human Services may not intimidate, threaten, coerce, discriminate against, or take other retaliatory action against individuals for exercising their rights or filing a complaint, individuals and others for filing a complaint with the Secretary, testifying, assisting, or participating in an investigation, compliance review, proceeding, or hearing, or good faith opposition to a prohibited act or practice. Waiving of rights. The Department of Health and Human Services cannot require an individual to waive their rights provided under any of the HIPAA rules for the purpose of providing treatment, payment, or enrollment in a health plan or eligibility for benefits. The Department of Health and Human Services is required to implement policies and procedures designed to comply with the breach and privacy rules. The Department of Health and Human Services is required to change policies and procedures as necessary and appropriate to comply with changes in the law and maintain consistency between policies, procedures, and the notice of privacy practices. As the Department of Health and Human Services is evolving into a more electronic environment, all of our policies and procedures will shift to accommodate the brave new world we have embarked on. The Department of Health and Human Services is required to document all changes made to policies and procedures and maintain all policies for 6 years. The Department of Health and Human Services is required to train employees on changes made to policies and procedures. All policies and procedures will be made available to the Department of Health and Human Services staff on the department's intranet site. The Department of Health and Human Services must maintain all documentation for 6 years from the date of its creation, including policies and procedures in written or electronic form, communications in written or electronic form when such communications are required in writing, and written or electronic records of actions, activities, or designations as required. What is the definition of PHI misuse? The following activities occurring in the absence of client authorization are considered misuse of protected health information. Access, using, taking, possession, release, editing, and destruction. Privacy violations fall in either one of two categories. Type 1, inadvertent or unintentional disclosure. Inadvertent, unintentional, or negligent act which violates policy and which may or may not result in PHI being disclosed. Disciplinary action for a Type 1 disclosure will be consistent with the county's personal regulations and the department's sanctions policy. Specific disciplinary action is determined with the collaboration of the privacy officer, director of human resources, and the program manager or service area chief. Type 2, intentional disclosure. Intentional act which violates the department's policies pertaining to that PHI which may or may not result in actual harm to the client or personal gain to the employee. Breach notification processes will be followed as described in the breach notification policy.